Kinos, you simply have unbroken text in which is 100 pages, and one does not realize that these are separate compositions. You will notice in the Kinos that there are actually 46 Kinos, but that is because one of them is repeated in the evening and in the daytime. So these are 45 distinct poems. The majority of them were written, at least in the Ashkenazic custom, were written by a single author. And this is the very, very famous liturgical poet, Rabbi Elazar, not Eliezer, Rabbi Elazar, HaKallir. The word Kallir is a bit obscure. Kallir is often connected to the name Kilurin, a balm for the eyes, because his words brought so much comfort. But it's very clear as well that his father seems to have been named Kallir, because the name in the acrostics of these poems will often say Elazar Rebbe Kallir. Who was Rabbi Elazar HaKallir? He was a tremendously prolific Paitan. He wrote much of what we say, the extra things that we say in the Yamim Noraim and the Chazaris Hashatz were poetry that he wrote. He wrote the majority of Kinos. In fact, he wrote many more Kinos than are included in our Kinos. He wrote many, many prayers, piyutim, for all of the Shabbosos of the year. Literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages. Who was he? So there is a big, big machlokas. According to Tosfos and Maseches Chagiga, Rabbi Elazar HaKallir was actually a Tana. He was the Elazar of Rabbi Shimon. So his father was actually Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And perhaps the word Kallir would refer to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, brought so much light to people's eyes. But many, many other Achronim point out that historically Tosfos is very problematical, and even Tosfos is understood as simply saying that Elazar HaKallir was a Gilgal, he was a reincarnation. He had the spiritual essence of Rabbi Elazar of Rabbi Shimon, but he actually lived much later. He lived around 500 years after the Chorban. So if the Chorban of the Bayis Sheni was in the year 70, Rabbi Elazar HaKallir lived in the 500s, the 600s, and the like. Now one has to understand a little bit of what was the historical situation in the time of Rav Kallir, because in his piyutim, we often sense not only a tremendous mourning over the Chorban Beis HaMikdash, but connecting it to all of the sorrows that were going on at the time. Rabbi Elazar HaKallir lived in Eretz Yisrael, and Eretz Yisrael at the time was under Byzantine rule. That was the eastern part of the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire had recently converted to Christianity. It had been a pagan empire, and as bad as the pagans were, the Chorban Beis HaMikdash, the destruction of Beitar, certainly we didn't have it easy. But when the Roman Empire became Christian, there was a fanatical hatred of the Jewish people. That is the period of time which didn't even happen during the Romans, in which the Sanhedrin was discontinued. That was the period of time when there was no longer Kiddush HaChodesh. That was the period of time where the Jewish settlement in Eretz Yisrael was almost totally decimated, which explains why the Talmud Yerushalmi had to be completed much earlier than the Talmud Bavli. And that is why it is truncated and the Nusach is not clear, because the whole community of Eretz Yisrael was under tremendous, tremendous persecution, in which people were literally being slaughtered, and nobody was living around Yerushalayim. The whole Jewish settlement was in the Galil, which is why, more accurately, the Talmud Yerushalmi was not a product of Yerushalayim, it was a product of Tiberia. Rabbi Elazar HaKallir is living during these times. He is living during the times when there was a Bitul Sanhedrin. He's living during the time when there are virtually no yeshivos in Eretz Yisrael at all, in which the Torah is hanging by a thread. Paradoxically, in Bavel, which was not under Byzantine rule, Bavel was under the Sasanian rule. Again, Persians, they weren't great either. Nobody was ever great for us. But nevertheless, there was the ability to learn Torah, the ability to build yeshivos, and as it were, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us a place where we were able to continue to grow. But Rabbi Elazar HaKallir, like Yirmiyahu Hanavi, many, many, many years earlier, is experiencing a tremendous, tremendous Chorban. And his Kinos, therefore, are reflecting the idea that the Chorban Beis HaMikdash was not just a past event, but it was happening again and again and again. The Churban of Torah, the Churban of the physical presence of Am Yisrael. His minhagim, his compositions are very, very complex. In fact, there's an Ibn Ezra in Koheles that is actually critical of Rabbi Elazar HaKallir, saying that his piyutim are too difficult to understand. In his piyutim, you have so many allusions. A single word will allude to a medrash. You actually need books, and there are books that are mefaneach. They try to decipher, oh, this word is referring to a whole medrash, a whole chazal, a whole Yerushalmi, etc. The Ibn Ezra was critical because the Ibn Ezra said if you didn't know all these midrashim, you wouldn't be able to figure out what the meaning is. But even that, they say, that during the Byzantine era, during much of the Byzantine era, Jews were allowed to daven, but they weren't allowed to study Torah. And as a result, he actually had a general idea of sneaking in a lot of Torah learning into his piyutim, because the soldiers let people daven, they didn't let them learn, and the like. Now, just to give you an example, we're going to start with the first of the morning piyutim, which is number 6, Shavas, and let me just talk about that just a little bit. The original minhag of piyutim was very, very different than the way we say it today. Originally, it was actually part of the Chazaras Hashatz. It was part of the repetition of the Shmona Esrei, meaning before the end of Magen Avram, they would say a single paragraph. Then they would say another paragraph before Mechayei HaMesim, then before Atar Kadosh. And then by the 14th bracha of Shmona Esrei, which is Binyan Yerushalayim, they would literally recite many, many Kinos before they would go on into Chazaras Hashatz. Now what happened was, eventually the Kinos were moved to after davening because the list got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Originally it may have been 3 or 4 Kinos. When it became 40 or 50 Kinos, they thought that was too much of a hefsek. But as a result, the first Kina is actually the second half of a first half that we no longer say that was part of Shmona Esrei. You need to know a little bit about Eicha. Eicha is Yirmiyahu's Lamentations, and Eicha involves Perek Aleph is written in the form of an Aleph Beis. Every pasuk begins with Aleph to Taf, and Beis, Gimel, Daled are also written in Aleph Beis, but they're slightly different. Perek Aleph is the only Aleph Beis that is simply in order, Aleph to Taf. Beis, Gimel, Daled reverses the Pei and the Ayin. The Pei is before the Ayin. That's an anomaly. Ayin normally comes before Pei, but why is there Pei before Ayin? So Chazal say that is part of the Yirmiyahu's Tochacha, Hiktim Peh La'ayin. They worship with their mouth idols that they weren't paying attention to their eyes. Their eyes could see that the idols were sheker vehevel. Hiktim Peh. They acted with their mouth what they didn't see with their eyes. Perek Gimel is a little unusual because in addition to the Pei before the Ayin, it is also 3 Aleph Beises, 3 psukim of Aleph, 3 psukim of Beis, etc. Perek Daled goes back to a single Aleph Beis, but the Pei is before the Ayin. Perek Hey is the only perek that is not written as an Aleph Beis. It is Zachor Hashem Hayalanu, but it also has 22 psukim. So, it has the number of psukim of the Aleph Beis, but it is not written in the form of the Aleph Beis. The Medrash tells us that the reason why there is an Aleph Beis is as if we come to Hashem and we say that we are suffering so completely from Aleph to Taf, from A to Z, but by the time we get to the last perek, we are so disoriented, we are so confused, we are drunk with sorrows that we can't even think straight. We don't even have an Aleph Beis anymore. Everything is a bilbul. Now, here is the thing to notice. You will notice that the first word of Kina 6 is Shavas. Shavas is the 15th pasuk in the 5th perek of Eicha. Shavas Misos Libenu. The first 14, Rabbi Elazar HaKallir wrote a piyut in which the first word of every paragraph was the first word of the 5th perek of Eicha. But originally, the first half is part of the Shmona Esrei. So therefore, for the first 14 brachas to Livnei Yerushalayim, it started Zachor, etc., etc., etc. And by the time you got to Bonei Yerushalayim, you did 14 of them. The rest of the piyut starts from pasuk 15, which is Shavas, and then it goes 16. In other words, every single stanza begins with the word in the last parak of Eicha, and then the next line, it goes in reverse order. 4, Suru is from parak Daled, and then there are 3 from parak Gimel. Sechi, etc., Sakosa, etc., and then you go 2, 1. So the way it works is 5, 4, 3, 3, 3, 2, 1, ending always with parak Aleph. And since everything begins from the 15th, because the first 14 were already in Shemona Esrei, that's why we begin with the letter Samach for the other prakim, and like the 15th letter of the Aleph base. So this is actually a second half of a piyut. The first half we no longer say, although you can find it in older machzerim. It was said in Chazaras Hashatz. And this is a very complicated style, but this really introduces the whole theme of Tisha B'Av, the Chorban Beis HaMikdash, the Golus Shechina, the suffering of the Jewish people, the fact that those who we thought would be our friends deceived us, caused us to die. There are many, many midrashim that are alluded to in this Kina, but they are more explicit later on, so we will defer the discussion of some of the allusions to Kinos that are more elaborate and more explicit. So we'll start. Okay, we're going to go to 10 Yud. We know that from the time of David HaMelech, when David made plans for the building of the Beis HaMikdash, which he was not able to build, he divided the Kohanim, all of the different Kohanim, into 24 Mishmaros, 24 groups. And the principle was that each week of the year, except for the Shalosh Regalim, when all the Kohanim came, a Mishmar did the Avodah for 1 week. So in the course of a year, the Mishmaros had 2 rotations. The Mishmar, in turn, was divided into a Beisav for every day of the week. Right? So any given day, you were a Mishmar, and you were also a member of a subdivision, which was a Beisav. The Gemara tells us, and it makes a point, that the names of the Mishmaros are names in Divrei Hayomim. They are recorded. That the Mishmar on duty on the day of the Chorban Beis HaMikdash and the day of Tisha B'Av, which was a Motzei Shabbos, it was a Sunday, it was Motzei Shemitah, it was the year after Shemitah. The Mishmar was a Mishmar called Yoshiyahu. That was the family name. But that name is a deeply symbolic name, because if you simply look at the words, Yoshiyahu, Ka Yariv, that means God is fighting against his people, or alternatively, people are fighting against God. They have rebelled against God, and that was a Chorban. Now, after the Chorban Beis HaMikdash, and particularly after the Chorban of Beitar, that was around 60 years later. So there were no Jews living in Yerushalayim at all. They were banned from Jerusalem. They all went north. And the 24 Mishmaros all went to the Galil, and that is why you will see that their location is all around the Galil. Now, this could not have been Bisman HaMikdash. Bisman HaMikdash, Kohanim tended to live near Yerushalayim. But after the Chorban of Beitar, they had separate cities. But it's important to understand that the concept of a Kohen knowing his Mishmar and the family Mishmaris living together remained for hundreds of years, even after the Chorban. This was one of the most powerful Zecher L'Mikdashes, in which if you were a Kohen, you knew your Mishmar, you knew the day that you would be doing Avodah in the Beis HaMikdash. Ad Kedei Kach, that it is recorded from the early Gaonim, that there was a minhag in Eretz Yisrael every Shabbos, because Shabbos is when the Mishmaros would change. The new Mishmar would take over in the afternoon. They would recite a Misha Beirach for the particular Mishmar. When did the Mishmaros discontinue? When did we lose a connection? When did we stop knowing what was the Kohen's day of Avodah? Many say it was during the time of Elazar HaKallir himself, that during the Byzantine persecutions, the concept of the Mishmaros became forgotten. And in many, many ways, this was an experience of a second Chorban, in which keeping the sense of the Kohanim gave us a connection to the Beis HaMikdash. and then it was lost. And that is why this is a Kina that is interweaving two themes of Avelis at the same time. On one hand, it's talking about the Chorban Beis HaMikdash, where the Kohanim could no longer do the Avodah, but then it talks about their exile from their place in the Galil. Now, that didn't happen the same time, because Pumfakert, after the Chorban Beis HaMikdash, is when they went to the Galil. So basically what Rabbi Elazar HaKallir is doing is, he is combining a past event, hundreds of years earlier, with the present reality of his time, in which he sees it as a continuity of the Chorban. And that is why he talks both about the Chorban Beis HaMikdash and the exile of the Mishmaros from Galilee, from the Galil, which occurred hundreds of years later, because that was the end of the sense of Kohanim being intimately connected to the Zechus of the Avodah. So we'll start Eicha Yashva Chavatzelas Hasharet. Eicha Yashva Chavatzelas Hasharet. The next was the next one, number 11, Yud Aleph. And here, again, unless otherwise noted, these are all by Rabbi Elazar HaKallir. This is the story of the death of King Yoshiyahu. Who was King Yoshiyahu? All of us know that one of the great righteous kings of Am Yisrael was Chizkiyahu HaMelech. And the Gemara in Brachos tells us Chizkiyahu HaMelech did not want to get married because he saw with Ruach HaKodesh that he would have a Rasha. And the Navi Yoshiyahu told him, you're Chayav Misa because you don't have the right to look into the future. You have a mitzvah of Piri Verivia. So Chizkiyahu HaMelech, who was very, very righteous, indeed got married, and he had a son. And that son did become a great, great Rasha, Menashe, who became a king at age 12 and had the longest rule of any king of Am Yisrael, 55 years. And during his time, Eretz Yisrael became Meshuka with Avodah Zarah, Gilui Araya, Shvichas Damim. Although there is a teaching that Menashe himself personally did tshuva at the end of his life, that's what it says in Divrei Hayamim. But Menashe was not able to reverse all of the chatoim that he created within Am Yisrael. He became a righteous person, but he created an environment of Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayos, Shvichas Damim. And at that point, it was decreed in Shemayim that although the Beis HaMikdash wouldn't be destroyed for a long time, but that is when it was decided there has to be a Chorban. Klal Yisrael is not worthy. Menashe had a son, Amain. Amain was just as bad. Amain followed in the ways of his father. Though things were going downhill, it looked like there was no hope for Am Yisrael. The Nevi'im gave Musar, nothing happened. But then Amain had a son, and that son was Yoshiyahu. And Amain died young, so Yoshiyahu became king at the age of 8 years old. He was a child king. And for reasons that we don't always understand, Yoshiyahu's heart turned towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu. His Rebbe was Chilkiah HaKohen. Chilkiah HaKohen is the father of Yirmiyahu ben Chilkiah. And Chilkiah HaKohen was Mechanech. And the first thing Yoshiyahu did when he was 8 years old, he ordered that the Beis HaMikdash that had been neglected because people weren't serving Hashem, there was a Beis HaMikdash, but they weren't doing anything there, should be fixed up, should be renovated. And as they renovated the Beis HaMikdash, they actually found a Sefer Torah. Some Meforshim learned that that itself was a great miracle because Menashe had destroyed all the Sifrei Torah. Others say, no, there were Sifrei Torah, but the miracle was that the Sefer Torah that was found in a subterranean chamber was open to a particular pasuk. And these are the psukim of the Teichacha in Devarim, that if you don't do tshuva, there's going to be a chorban. And Yoshiyahu, as it were, eradicated the Avodah Zarah. Yoshiyahu brought Am Yisrael to tshuva. And at that point, the Nevi'im thought, perhaps in the merit of Am Yisrael's tshuva through Yoshiyahu, we will be Zeicha to a Geula, not just that the Beis HaMikdash would stay, but that there would be Mashiach, there would be, maybe Yoshiyahu himself would be Mashiach, Malchus Beis David. And this would be the Geula Shleima. But Yoshiyahu did not do all that he thought he did, because it says that although externally people were not worshiping idols, mibachutz, but behind closed doors they were laughing at him. Behind closed doors they were mocking him. They continued to do averos b'tzina, and as a result, although he was worthy of being Mashiach, the generation was not worthy of escaping the Churban. What happened at that time was Paro, who was an ally of the Jewish people, he was not an enemy, Paro Necho, wanted to wage war against Assyria. Assyria is north of Eretz Yisrael. And he wanted to simply go through Eretz Yisrael with his army, not to wage war against the Jews, but simply to go to Assyria. But Yoshiyahu said he's not going to allow that, because Hashem promised if the Jewish people do the mitzvos, Cherev leisaver bi'artzachem, a foreign sword shall not go through your land. And that doesn't just mean he learned a cherev of milchama, but even a cherev of a peaceful nation that's trying to fight somebody else will not pass through. So he was so batuach in his righteousness and in the righteousness of Am Yisrael that he said, we are worthy of the divine promise. V'cherev leisaver bi'artzachem. So he told Paro, no. Yirmiyahu warned him. He says, we're not that worthy. We're not on the Madrega. Don't do this. Let him go. But Yoshiyahu says, nope, we are righteous. What happened in the plains of Megiddo? Paro entered, and at this point, Paro was not entering to be peaceful. Paro was entering to conquer and to dominate. And Yoshiyahu HaMelech tried to fight the armies of Egypt at Megiddo. And his body was pierced with 300 arrows like a sieve. And he was dying. The great, great tzaddik, Yoshiyahu, died. And the Leitzanei Hador, the scoffers of the generation, wanted to know what was he muttering in his last words. Maybe he's cursing out God, maybe he's cursing out the Nevi'im. And no, his last words were, Tzaddiku Hashem, God is righteous, Ki pihu marisi, because I have rebelled against his word. This, by the way, is a pasuk in the first parak of Eicha. Yirmiyahu essentially borrowed it. He lifted it from Yoshiyahu's final words. The fourth parak of Eicha, Eicha yuam zahav, how the gold is dimmed, is actually not about the Beis HaMikdash. This was Yirmiyahu's eulogy for the Melech Yoshiyahu, that he later incorporated into Eicha, because he understood with Ruach HaKodesh and Nevuah that the death of Yoshiyahu was the final hammer blow, the final nail in the coffin that would result in the Churban Beis HaMikdash. This was the last real chance. Now, the Churban didn't happen until 22 years later, the days of Tzidkiyahu, who was Yoshiyahu's son. But throughout that time, the Malachim were not good. The people were not good. Sometimes the Malachim were Rishayim, and sometimes, like Tzidkiyahu, he was a tzaddik, and the people were Rishayim. Without Yoshiyahu, there was no real ability to have tshuva, and therefore, Eicha yuam zahav, how is the gold dimmed, was incorporated in Eicha. And indeed, the Rabbi Elazar HaKallir brings a teaching, and we can almost trace everything to Midrashim, but this is a teaching that we don't know. We have no makor for it, but it must be a medrash that is lost. In the merit of Yirmiyahu being maspid, the righteous Yoshiyahu, with the letters of the Aleph Beis, the 22 psukim of the Aleph Beis, Hashem delayed the Churban Beis HaMikdash by 22 years. Because being maspid, the righteous, is a great, great zechus, because when you feel that the tzaddikim are things that are those that keep you alive spiritually, then that itself is a closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So here in this Kina, Rabbi Elazar HaKallir graphically, poetically, and tragically describes the death of Yoshiyahu. But again, the key to remember is that this is not simply the death of a great person as righteous as he was. This was considered to be the final nail that guaranteed that there would be a Churban Beis HaMikdash. Vayikainen Yirmiyahu al Yoshiyahu Eicha Eli Kainenu Me'ela Ben Shemaina Shan Eicha L'Drashman Lohav. We now go to number 13, Yud Gimel. And here, Rabbi Elazar HaKallir very beautifully takes the word Eicha, Eicha. 3 chapters of Eicha begin with the word Eicha. Eicha means, how could it be? But you can actually divide Eicha into 2 words. Ko. We know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu makes many, many promises to Am Yisrael. Ko Amar Hashem. So Hashem says. Brachos, Yeshuos, Nechamos. And Elazar HaKallir says that at the time of the Churban, we turn to Am Yisrael and we say, Ko, where is all the Ko Amar Hashems that you've given us? And he goes through a list of 13 beautiful prophecies of comfort, of strength. For example, Hashem says to Avraham, Ko Yezarecha, all your children will have great multitudes. Or all of the different brachos. And where is it? Just to show you one example inside as to how one has to pay very, very careful attention. If you look towards the end, it says, Ko siach shishim oisiyos hakadumais. Where is the kai of the conversation of the 60 ancient letters? What are the 60 ancient letters? Birkas Kohanim, Yivarechecha Hashem v'yishmerecha, has 60 letters in it, if you count, from Yasam L'cha Shalom. And it begins in the Torah, when the Torah introduces Birkas Kohanim, it says, Ko sivorchu es b'nei Yisrael, so shall you bless. So see poetically how this is expressed. Where is the Ko of the 60 letters that are supposed to protect us? And now we have been totally destroyed and decimated. Chazals do say that the word Eicha has this composite meaning. Eicha means how could it be? But it also means Ko, where is the Ko of all of your promises? And finally it connects it to Adam HaRishon. When Adam HaRishon ate from the Eitz Hadas, HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Adam B'Chava, Ayeka, where are you? And that doesn't mean that Hashem needs to know where they are. The Eibishter certainly knows where they are. But essentially, Ayeka, what has happened to you? Where are you holding? Look at what you've become. So it's all connected. Eicha, how has it happened? Ko, where is the Ko of all of your promises that are Ko Amar Hashem? But the answer is, how is it happening? Where is the Ko? Ayeka, Hashem says back to us, where are you? Where are we? Where are we holding? You know, the Paitan says, we say to Hashem, why are you doing all of these things? But HaKadosh Baruch Hu says back, but you don't seem to know, why did we do all of these things? Right, so the Eicha goes through the list of the positive prophecies of comfort and strength that begin with Ko Amar Hashem. Eicha Omer Kareis Liav B'Petzach V'B'chis Bein Absorim Ko Yeh L'Netzach. Okay, we go to Test Science 16. And if the star of Yoshiyahu is a tragedy that happened in the Churban Bayis Rishon, we now move to the Churban Bayis Sheni in the hands of the Romans. And we know that the Roman general who actually destroyed the second Beis HaMikdash, who later became emperor, is Titus HaRasha. And Titus, as you know, even erected a triumphal arch celebrating his great accomplishment. There is said to be a minhag that Jewish people in Rome do not walk under that arch. That has that famous picture of the Jews in chains carrying the menorah on their shoulder. And here Rabbi Elazar HaKallir discusses a passage in the Gemara and in the Medrash, how Titus actually entered the Kodesh HaKadoshim. He basically thought in his arrogance that he vanquished God, and he comes into the house of Hashem. He extinguishes the Ner Tamid, the eternal light that never goes out. He then enters the Kodesh HaKadoshim, which only the Kohen Gadol is allowed to enter. But not only does he enter the Kodesh HaKadoshim, but he spreads a Sefer Torah on the ground. And he has fornication with a prostitute on top of a Sefer Torah in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. And when he stuck his sword into the parochas, the curtain of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, blood came out. And Titus, with his arrogance, concluded, he killed HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He mastered HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the Paitan is amazed. How could Hashem allow this? How could Hashem not do anything? How could Hashem withdraw his hand, so to speak, to let such a rishus happen in the world? Even if Klal Yisrael is worthy of punishment, even if we're not deserving of Gula, but how could such a thing happen? How could HaKadosh Baruch Hu not be concerned for the desecration of his name? And then Titus took thousands and thousands of Jewish boys and Jewish girls back to Rome, together with the treasures of the Beis HaMikdash, and he was going to use them for immoral purposes, prostitution, homosexuality. And the Gemara records that a number of the young children jumped off. They went into the ocean. They drowned rather than using these affairs. Again, halachically, there's some question about, are you allowed to commit suicide to prevent it? But nevertheless, this is the Maisa that is recorded. We know that the Gemara does tell us that Titus had a very ignominious end, that he said that when there began to be a tremendous storm on the sea, Titus said to God, God, you only have power on the sea, Kriyas Yamsuf, but on land you have no power. That's why I could destroy the Beis HaMikdash. He says, fight with me on land and we'll see how powerful you are. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu said about Titus, I don't need to fight with you on land. I could take my most insignificant creature, a tiny insect, a gnat, and that gnat will be enough to defeat you. And it is recorded that a parasite or some type of insect entered Titus's nostril, and it became like a tumor, and it actually says he had excruciating pain for a number of years. And the only time that this gnat stopped knocking in his head is when it heard the sound of a blacksmith. So the Gemara records, if it was a non-Jewish blacksmith, Titus paid the guy money. If there was a Jewish blacksmith, Titus said, it's enough that you see the downfall of your enemy. But eventually, this parasite got used to it, and it kept on knocking. Titus eventually died. When they did an autopsy in Rome, they found that the gnat had grown to the size of a bird, and it had metal, copper claws, and an iron beak. And this was the death of Titus. HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Titus, I don't need to fight against you. You are so insignificant that the smallest of my creatures can destroy you. There is one thing about Titus, though, that Titus did say a very interesting thing. He is, of course, known as a Rasha, a Mecharef, a Megadef, a blasphemer, one who did the unspeakable, the unimaginable in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. But Josephus, who was a Jewish man, who was actually a witness to the Churban, he had been a Jewish general, he had surrendered to the Romans, and he's somewhat like our Benedict Arnold. Josephus quotes Titus as saying, when Titus is looking at all of the fighting that there is within the Jews themselves, Titus said at one point, so says Josephus, perhaps I don't have to destroy the Beis HaMikdash. If I wait long enough, the Jewish people will destroy it themselves. Again, we don't know if Titus actually said this or not, but this just shows you that the sinas chinam of Am Yisrael during the Bayis Sheni was so apparent that even the Rasha Titus was able to see it. And he knew that that would be a cause of the Churban. So this is Zachor. Remember what the adversary did in the Holy of Holies. Zachor asher asa tzar bifinim shalaf charba yuba lefnai v'lefnim. Okay, we're now going to go to Yud Tes, number 19. And this is what is called a Siduk Hadin. It is based on a pasuk in Daniel, where Daniel's prayer, Daniel was in Bavel during the first Korban. L'cha Hashem atzdaka, we begin Slichos every day with this. L'cha Hashem atzdaka, to you HaKadosh Baruch Hu is righteousness and charity. V'lanu boshes hapanim, and to us there is only shame. We have been, so to speak, complaining until now. We've been talking about sorrows and suffering and punishment and chilul Hashem. And we've been saying, Hashem, why do you let this happen? Why don't you step in and stop it? And of course, that's what we think about on Tisha B'Av. But in some ways, that may give a person a wrong attitude. That may give a person tinus, complaints against the justice of God. So after a relatively long litany of all the things that have gone wrong, we now have to declare that God is righteous and God is merciful. And all that has happened to us is because of our averos. And in fact, even in Hashem's punishments, the chesed is much, much greater than the punishment. We know at every levaya, when a person loses a relative, there is what is called tziduk hadin, in which you justify the righteousness of God's din. It comes from Eov, when Eov does all of these sufferings, goes through all of these sufferings. Eov says, Hashem nasan v'Hashem lakach, Hashem gives and Hashem takes, Yehi Shem Hashem mevarach. And may the name of God be blessed. And we say this to this very day at Levaya. So this is a long tziduk hadin in which all of the chastei hamakim that He's done for us, and all of the ways we did not repay that chesed with our mitzvos and our ma'asim tovim. Just one point, if you look at the very end of the capital of the Kina. So again, there's a reference that's a little obscure. It says, L'cha Hashem atzdaka, to you Hashem is charity, righteousness. B'teisha me'ay shana, shahaisa sina kavusha malishama. For the 900 years that you kept your anger intact and was not expressed. And we have boshes hapanim, and therefore we ask Hashem to have mercy on us again. So there's always an obscure reference. What is the 900 years in which God's anger was not expressed? So the Meforshim explain that this is a close approximation. If you think about the number of years from the time the Jews left Mitzrayim till the Chorban Beis HaMikdash, we know that the Beis HaMikdash was built 480 years after Yetzias Mitzrayim. That's in the book of Malachim. That's in the book of Kings. We know that the first Beis HaMikdash stood 410 years. So 480 plus 410 is 890 years. That's almost 900 years. And the emes is, the Jewish people were not deserving to even leave Mitzrayim. We were on the 49th level of impurity. The Egyptians said, or the angels of Egypt said, why should the Jewish people be saved on the Yam Suf? Halalu ovdei avodah zarah, they too are idol worshippers like the Egyptians. So for almost 900 years, HaKadosh Baruch Hu kept us alive, even though we didn't have the zechus of kiyum. And for that 900 years, or the 890 years, your anger did not get expressed until the Chorban. There is another point here as well. If you factor out the years of traveling in the desert, it turns out we were in Eretz Yisrael before the Chorban 850 years, because you have 440, 440, and 410. Because just from the time we entered Eretz Yisrael, that's 850 years. This too has a great, great significance. We read in this morning's Haftarah, Ki Seiled Banim Uvnei Banim, when you have children and grandchildren, V'nei Shantem B'Aretz, and you will be in the land a long time, and you worship idols, I will destroy you. Rashi points out from Chazal that the gematria of V'naishantem is 852 years, that had we remained in Eretz Yisrael 852 years of Avodah Zarah, there would have been no possibility of our recovering. Abei tabdun maher, you will be utterly lost. And therefore God brought the Chorban 2 years earlier, not 852, but 850. So it turns out that which looked like a Chorban, why is Hashem so mean? He brings the Chorban earlier than he had to. Fakert. It was precisely that Chorban that created the possibility of Geula. So when it says here, Hashem waited X number of years, it's not only referring to the fact that he waited until a certain point to destroy us, that is Rachamim. But the fact that he did it earlier and not later is also Rachamim. Because had it been 852 years, that would have been Keminyan V'naishantem, and the gematria of V'naishantem would have been Abei Tabdun Maher. You would be utterly destroyed. So this is our Siddur Kadin, in which we are makabel on ourselves the righteousness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Hanhagos. L'cha Adonai Tzedakah. Yeah, we go now to 21, Chaf Aleph. And 21 is the first first Kina that we have that is not authored by Rabbi Elazar HaKallir. In fact, this is anonymous. We really don't know. And this describes the death, the martyrdom of the 10 great sages of Am Yisrael. These are called the Asara Harugei Malchus. And there are many, many different poetic and midrashic versions of their death. You may recall that in the on Yom Kippur, we recite this during the Musaf, but not this one. We have a different piyut, and there are many shinuyim in terms of the story between what we say on Yom Kippur and what we say on Tisha B'Av. Some of the rabbis are different, and some of the details are different as well. Another thing you need to know about the Asara Harugei Malchus is that although poetically it is described as if they are killed one after the other, in fact, they did not live in the same time. They were killed over a period of 100 years, and some died at one point, some died after the Chorban, some died before the Chorban, some died in the Bar Kokhba revolt at Beitar. But with Ruach HaKodesh, Chazal saw that although these were deaths that occurred at different times and at different places, and they didn't occur right at the same time and not by the same emperor, nevertheless they were connected. There was a din shamayim that Hashem wanted to take the great tzaddikim from the world because we were not worthy of being protected. As it were, the presence of tzaddikim in the world creates protection. This is an important idea. You know, in the past few years, we've lost Gedolei Olam, who Baruch Hashem, by and large, with some exceptions, had arichas yamim. They lived a long time, over 100 years old. And one might wonder, why should I cry so much? A person who lives 104, people die. I mean, it's not like somebody was taken as a young person. But one has to understand that the death of a tzaddik isn't simply, I've lost a tzaddik, or the tzaddik is not here. It makes our very existence much more precarious, much more dangerous, much more risky. There's a chusim of tzaddikim that are makayim the world in the schus of their Torah and Avodah. And that is why, on one hand, we have actually two contradictory ideas. It's hard to reconcile them. That the death of a tzaddik takes away shmira from the world, and it makes us vulnerable. At the same time, we say, the death of a tzaddik is a kapara for the world. Misa tzaddikim is a kapara. But the emes is, it may not be a contradiction, because it is not the death alone that it's a kapara. But if through the tzaddik's death I realize how much was lost, how much was taken away, and then I resolve in my own life to do whatever I can in whatever little way to be mashlim the chisarim, precisely because I'm aware of the fact that we need shmira, that then becomes a sechus that could be matzil the world. I'm not going to go over all 10. They are enumerated here, but the first three are very well known. We have Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who was the Nasi of Am Yisrael. And by the way, there are a few Rav Shimon ben Gamliels, but this is the Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel that is the father of Rav Yehuda HaNasi, the author of the Mishnah. So Rav Yehuda HaNasi's father is one of the Asara Harugei Malchus. He was the Nasi of Am Yisrael. Rabbi Yishmael was the Kohen Gadol. And there is the story that this is not actually mentioned here, but in the Yom Kippur version of the story, it is said that the death of the 10 martyrs was a kapara for the 10 tribes that were involved in Mechiras Yosef. Because the Torah says, you take a person and you sell him. You kidnap a person and you sell him. You are chayav misa. So the 10 Asarugei Malchus are connected, the 10 Shvatim, that were Mocher, Gonei, Vishu, Macharei, Mais Yumas. And Rabbi Shimon Gamliel was the first to die. But then Rabbi Yishmael was so beautiful, so handsome, that the Caesar's daughter begged to keep him alive. Her father said no. So instead she asked that his face should be peeled so she could keep his facial features on some type of base. And that the father was perfectly happy to do. And as his face was being combed with iron combs, again, this happened with Rabbi Akiva as well, when they reached the place of the tefillin, he cried out, because how could he lose that right to serve Hashem, or that privilege of serving Hashem with tefillin? There is one passage here, again, it's Tisha B'Av, so we're not marich in Inyanei Halacha. It mentions, though, that after Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel was executed, decapitated, Rabbi Yishmael took his head and he put his mouth on his mouth and he put his eyes on his eyes. And he said, how could the beauty of Am Yisrael be taken away? And people ask the obvious question. Rabbi Yishmael was a Kohen Gadol. Kohen Gadol. A Kohen Gadol is not allowed to become Tameh with a dead body. How is Rabbi Yishmael allowed to be Metameh himself? And there are different answers that are given. One of the answers is that Rabbi Yishmael is already Tameh, like the Rabbi Yishmael is already Tameh because he's in a building, and if there's a dead body in the building, he's Tameh. And the Shitas HaRavid is, if a Kohen is Tameh, there is no Isser for him to become Tameh again. Now the question is whether we pass like that, that's not so clear, but at least according to the Ravid, you would have an answer. Another answer is, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel was the Nasi of Am Yisrael. And to honor a Nasi, there is no limit. Just like a Meis Mitzvah, if you have an unattended corpse that nobody is taking care of, the Kohen Gadol is Metameh. So for a Nasi, no matter how many people are going to take care of him, it's never Lefi Chavodo. Therefore, according to this, a Kohen is allowed to be Metameh for a Nasi Shebi Yisrael. Again, it's machlokas how to learn this exactly. The next is Rabbi Akiva. All of us know the story of Rabbi Akiva, how he was an Amoris till the age of 40. But then he devoted himself for 24 years. And his wife let him do this. She not only let him, she encouraged him to do it. And he became the greatest of the Gedolim. And he dies al Kiddush Hashem. And he said, all of my life, his Talmidim said to him, Zu Torah v'zu schara, is this the reward for Torah? And Rabbi Akiva said, all of my life I wanted to fulfill the pasuk. V'yahavta es Hashem aleikecha b'chol levavecha, with all of your soul, heart, b'chol nafshecha, with all of your nefesh. Afilu hu neitel es nafshecha. And now I have the opportunity of giving my life for Hashem, al Kiddush Hashem. And it is said that even the angels in heaven went to the Almighty. And they said, Zu Torah v'zu sechara, this is the reward for your Torah. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu answered, Shtaik, keep quiet. Kach ola b'machshava lefanai, this is my thought. Don't question me. The Shalah HaKadosh gives this explanation. The Torah says originally God created the world with the Midas Hadin, Bereshis bara Elokim. He then saw that the world could not survive with strict din. So he combined din and rachamim. That's why it says, Biyom asos Hashem Elokim. But that is only true for most people. For the great tzaddikim of the generation, Hashem still gives the midas hadin, and that was Hashem's machshava. So when Hashem says, Kach ola b'machshava lefanai, the Shalach HaKadosh says, tzaddikim are judged by my machshava. In strict din, even Rabbi Akiva doesn't make it. But that's how tzaddikim are judged. And then we talk about Rav Chutzpitz, the Metorgaman. Rav Chutzpitz, technically, he was not his own Rosh Hashiva. A Metorgaman was somebody who translated or communicated the teachings of others. But he was a gadol, a kadosh, and it mentions that the chazirim, the pigs, were dragging his tongue. That tongue that expressed the words of Torah so beautifully was being dragged by pigs in the dirt. The Gemara actually tells us, Elisha ben Avuya, who became a heretic for many reasons. But one of the reasons he became a heretic was he saw the tongue of Rav Chutzpitz being dragged in the dirt, and that he couldn't understand how the tongue that taught Torah would be treated this way. So what do we think about when we think about the Arzei HaLevanon, the cedars of Lebanon? In fact, the whole, our street across the street, Arzei Habira, is named after the Talmidei Chachamim that are called Arzei Lebanon, the cedars of Lebanon. They protect us with their strength, with their Torah, with their righteousness. On one level, it's Tisha B'Av, so we mourn not just the destruction of the Mikdash, but we mourn the death of the Tzaddikim, the death of Talmidei Chachamim, which is even greater than the Churban Beis HaMikdash. But we then have to resolve that if we live in a world of shemama, of desolation, we have to, lefi our puny madrega, try to make up, try to build what it is that we've lost. Arzei Levana, Nadiri Atayra. I just wanted to go back for a second. One of the Asarugei Malchus is Rabbi Hanania ben Teradje, and a very famous story. It's based on a Gemara in Avodah Zarah, that he was wrapped with the Sefer Torah around him. Sponges that were wet with water were put on his heart to delay his death, so he would suffer the burning. They set it on fire, but they wanted to slow up his death, so he would suffer. And as he was being burned to death, he told his Talmidim in his final moments of life that I see the parchment of the Torah burning, but the letters of the Torah are flying up to Shemayim. The Jewish people, or many, can be physically destroyed, although Baruch Hashem, we will never be totally physically destroyed. But the Torah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu will always be here. There will always be Torah, will always be the holiness of Torah. That will sustain us. That even if the physical Sefer gets burnt, the letters of Hashem that those physical Svarim represent will never, never be destroyed. The next few salichos, we're not going to say, I'll just say a few words about them outside. These are salichos, these are not from Elazar HaKallir, these were written many, many years later. And these are connected to the Crusades. The Crusades, the first Crusade was in 1096. That often is referred to by the Hebrew date, Tatnu, which is 4,896, which is 56, which is 1096. This was in the time of Rashi, the Balei HaTosfos, and Christianity was trying to regain control of Eretz Yisrael. But on the way, as they went through France and Germany, they decided to massacre many, many Jewish communities. Thousands of Jews, maybe tens of thousands, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of Jews, were massacred in these crusades because they refused to convert to Christianity. The Mordechai, you may have heard, the Mordechai was one of the great, great Rishonim. The Mordechai and his entire family was wiped out in what was called the Rheinfleisch massacres. It's interesting that the Balei HaTosfos were both in France and in Germany. But we have very, very few Tosfos from the German communities. We only have them from the French communities. And it's been posited That is because the German Balei Atosos were almost totally wiped out, and their Sforim were totally destroyed. So there are many, many ideas which talk about the persecutions of the First Crusade, based on the concept that all of the Chorban that happens to Klal Yisrael is an outgrowth of the ninth of Av. That because there's no Mikdash, which means there's no Shekhinah, because we are distant from God, because we haven't merited redemption, every single thing happens. And in fact, there's a very famous passage in some of these Slichos that says, we do not add an extra day of mourning for these tragedies, because all of these tragedies are subsumed in the Avelis of the ninth of Av. In fact, this is what the Brisker Rav used to quote us when people asked the Brisker Rav, why should we not have a separate day of fasting in memory of the 6 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust? That's certainly a devastating tragedy. And the Brisker Rav quoted the Kinos, Ein lahosif moed. One does not add a moed for this. One folds it in, so to speak, in the ninth of Av. That is one important point. A second important point is that in these Kinos it describes a horrendous scene, which again halachically is very problematical, in which the Goyim surround a castle in which families are trapped, and says, convert or we will destroy you. And it seems to be recorded that parents killed their children and then killed themselves in order not to be tortured into rejecting Yiddishkeit and embracing Avodah Zarah. Again, halachically, this is a very, very serious problem, but there is no question that historically this did occur, in which Jews not only were willing to die before they would go to Avodah Zarah, but Jews actually took their own lives and even the lives of others. And when we think about the Crusades, we also think about the Holocaust, we think about all of the tsaras, and we know it's because we don't have the Mikdash, we don't have the relationship with Hashem, that there is Hester Panim in the world. And when there's Hester Panim, all of these things happen. But the next thing we're going to go to is Chafav, number 26. And again, we're back to Rabbi Elazar HaKallir, and we're back to a medrash that is describing something that happened in the first Churban Beis HaMikdash. Yirmiyahu HaNavi was given the task of being the prophet of destruction, the prophet who communicated that the Mikdash would be destroyed, and the prophet who actually experienced the destruction. And he didn't want this job. He asked Hashem, don't give me this job. Why do you give me the job that I'm the one that has to come in and tell Am Yisrael that their time is up? But that was his mission in life. In fact, Rav Schiller often points out that Yirmiyahu was a Navi. Chazal say Ruach HaKodesh and Nevuah cannot be on a person unless they're happy, unless they're in a state of joy. So how could Yirmiyahu be the prophet of destruction? How can you ever be a prophet of destruction if Nevuah can exist only in a state of simcha? And the answer is, in some paradoxical way, as broken as you are, your kesher with HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives you chizuk and gives you simcha at the same time. So the Medrash tells us that Yirmiyahu HaNavi went to the Ma'aras HaMachpelah, and he called on the Avos, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, pray for your people. Why are you sleeping? Why are you in your grave? Come and daven for Am Yisrael. And the Medrash itself is very different than the Kina. In fact, one might even suspect that Rabbi Elazar HaKallir had a different Medrash than the one that we know. The Medrash in Eicha says that the Avos prayed to Hashem, but Hashem refused to listen. Hashem said to Avram, it's not enough. Yitzchak, Yaakov, Moshe Rabbeinu. Hashem rejected their prayers. And the only prayer Hashem was makabel was the prayer of Rachel Imeinu. When Rachel Imeinu said, the night I was supposed to be with Yaakov and Lavan switched Leah. And I had made up with Yaakov secret identification signs so he would know that whether it's me or her. And I gave those signs to my sister so she would not be humiliated. And Hashem said, for that I will bring redemption to the Jewish people. Rachel Mavaka Banah, the pasuk that Rachel cries for her children. And Hashem says, Meni kolech mibechi, withhold your voice from crying. Yesh sachar lepulasech, there will be reward for your actions. V'shavu banim legvulam, your children will return to their boundary. And the Bali Musar explained what's going on here. Avram and Yitzchak had the Akedah, and Yaakov produced 12 tribes. And Moshe Rabbeinu, the Medrash says, Matan Torah, Kriyas Yamsuf, he brought them unto Am Yisrael. The Makos. Amazing things, miracles. That wasn't enough. Rachel? Listen, Rachel basically delayed it only by a week. I mean, she married him a week later. What's the big deal? And the Bali Musar say that with Rachel we see the idea of love, selfless love. She didn't have to give her sister anything. Her sister was doing something wrong to her. It was wrong for Leah to take Rachel's place. But Rachel had so much rachamim, so much chesed, so much love, so much of a desire that another Jew shouldn't suffer, be humiliated or embarrassed because of her, that she gave up something very, very precious. And that will be the Siba for Klal Yisrael's redemption. Because if the Churban came because of sinas chinam, a sinner that was not deserved, as Rav Kook used to say, the Geula will come when there's avas chinam, when we love, even when there's lav dafke, a reason that we can identify. And it is that avas chinam that is the schus of Rachel. Now the reason I say that Rabbi Elazar HaKallir may have been operating with a different version is in this piyut you're going to see, or in this Kina you're going to see, he does not assign a special role for Rachel. He simply looks at a communal prayer of Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Moshe, and then Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, and Bilhah v'Zilpah. And he has a version that says it is the collective merit of the Avos and the Imahos that are going to bring a Geula for Am Yisrael. And the Gemara tells us that although we no longer have Zechus Avos means Hashem loves us in the merit of the Avos. That we don't have, that we've lost. But there's something else that we have, and that is Bris Avos. Bris Avos is the covenant that Hashem made, and that covenant cannot be abrogated. So this describes Yirmiyahu approaching the Avos and Moshe Rabbeinu. The Medrash tells us one other unforgettable scene, a scene that can rip your heart out if you think about it. That as the Jewish people are being led in chains after the Churban, and they're walking over corpses and body parts, but those who are still alive are being led in chains. And Yirmiyahu Hanavi not only turned to the Avos, but he also turned to Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu actually appeared in body. And the people saw Moshe Rabbeinu coming. And what would you think if you see Moshe Rabbeinu coming? Our Goyal has come back. Our Redeemer has come back. This will be like a second Yetzias Mitzrayim. Although we're in Eretz Yisrael, we'll be brought back to Eretz Yisrael. But alas, that was not to be. Moshe Rabbeinu was there to comfort them. But he had to tell them, the Churban is Hashem's Gezerah. I have to leave you now, at least physically. I will be with you in spirit through the Torah that I taught you. But it is not yet the time for the redemption. So we read Az B'Halach Yirmiyahu, Al Kivrei Avais, V'na Matzamais Chavivais Matem Shaychavais. The next one, 27, Chavsayin, again by Rabbi Elazar HaKallir, is yet another medrash involving Yirmiyahu, that at the time of the Churban, Yirmiyahu was wandering around in a stupor, around the Harabayas, around the Temple Mount, and he encounters a beautiful woman who is disheveled and in rags and in sackcloth, menuvelas. She seems to be in a very dirty, filthy state. But he sees a tremendous beauty, but she is fearsome and frightening to look at. And he's not sure what he's looking at. Is this a human being? Is this a demon? Is this an angel of destruction? What is it? And he demands to know, who is this thing? Person, demon, angel? And the woman answers him, I am not a demon, nor am I a human being. I am one who belongs to 1, and to 3, and to 60, and to 12, and to 71. And again, it's very enigmatic, but she explains. I come from one that is Avraham Avinu, who is unique in the world, that the whole world didn't believe in Hashem, and he was the one person who taught about Emunah in Hashem. And I am connected to 3, those are the 3 Avos generally, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And I'm connected to 12, these are the 12 Shvatim. And the 60 are the 60 myriads. A myriad is 10,000, 600,000 Jews that left Mitzrayim. And the 71 is the Sanhedrin. And what this basically is this woman, as it were, is nothing less than the representation of the Jewish people that took, in this vision at least, we don't know if this is a vision or a reality, did he see this? Was it physically there? That Am Yisrael was like the widow that is bereft of her husband, at least temporarily, in which there's a tremendous beauty and radiance and goodness, but it's covered up with filth. Now the filth is not only the persecutions of Galus, but the Averos that we commit. But the Averos are only surface deep. Beneath the surface, there is beauty and goodness and holiness and radiance. That we are connected, no matter how far a Jew is, we are connected to Avraham Avinu and to the Avos and to the generation that left Mitzrayim and to the Sanhedrin, which is the source of Torah. And Yirmiyahu then reassures the woman that there will be a redemption, and she begs the Navi to be mispalel. To be mispalel and go to the Avos. That's why the emes is, many Meforshim actually say, this was the prelude to the one we just read about going to the Avos, because logically it should have been in reverse order. But again, what we learn from this is, we learn that intrinsically, even when Am Yisrael is in a state of sin, there's a great love that Hashem has and a great love that we have for Hashem, even if we cannot always consciously feel it and know it. And it is from the goodness that is within us that tshuva becomes possible. Because tshuva, in a very literal sense, means to return. On one level, you return to God. On the other level, you are returning to yourself. You are becoming what it is you already are. It's not about changing. It's about reconnecting to what is already within a person, just as this woman covered in filth and in rags and in dirt is a person of great, great beauty. Okay, we now turn to Lamed Daled, number 34. This is a piyut by Rav Yehuda Halevi, very, very well-known. Yehuda Halevi was one of the greats. Gedolim in Spain during the Golden Age. This were several hundred years before the Spanish Inquisition. He was the author of the Kuzari. His name is spelled out in the acrostic, Yud, Hey, Vav, Daled, Hey, Yehuda. And we'll have another Kina from him. I'll mention the biography a little later. But this is referring to the story in the Gemara about the killing of the Navi Zechariah. Now, this is not the Zechariah of the Bayesheni that has a biblical book. This is a Zechariah ben Yehoyada HaKohen. And this was over 150 years before the Chorban Beis HaMikdash. Way before the Chorban Beis HaMikdash. He was giving Musar to Am Yisrael, that if they don't do tshuva, there will be a Chorban and a Galus. And he was murdered by the orders of King Yoash. He was murdered in the Beis HaMikdash itself, right next to the Mizbeach. He was both a Kohen, and he was a Navi, and Bechlal, it was Ritzicha, And it was Shabbos, and it was Yom Kippur, and he was murdered. And his blood bubbled like it was boiling blood, and it could not be covered no matter what you put on top of it. It bubbled and it percolated through for almost 200 years. When Nebuzaradan, the general of Nebuchadnezzar, came to destroy the Beis HaMikdash, he saw this bubbling blood and he wanted to know what it was. So they didn't want to tell him the story. They said, well, this is the blood of Korbanos. It's boiling, whatever it is. So he shechted a lot of animals. Obviously, that didn't happen. And they finally forced them to tell him that we killed a Navi. We were not Makabel Musar. So he said, I'm going to placate this blood. And he began slaughtering indiscriminately. He says 80,000 people. He slaughtered to get that blood to rest. And that blood still didn't rest. And Nebuzaradan finally said to the blood, really saying to Hashem, do you want me to destroy everybody in Am Yisrael? Which of course he would do if he got the green light. And then the blood stopped. And the blood rested and it was able to be covered, able to be buried. The Gemara in Gittin tells us that Nebuzaradan was so shook up, as brutal as he was. He saw what an Aveira was, the Aveira of killing a Navi, had such a punishment. Then he realized, what's going to happen to me for all the people that I killed and all that I destroyed? That Chazal record that he ran away from the Babylonian army and he became a ger, he became a righteous convert. So we see in many ways, as tragic as this is, we see, number one, the tragedy of not listening to a Navi and what that could result in. And we see, number two, the power of tshuva. That even if a person does tshuva, really for the most ulterior and basest of motives. In other words, he basically said, hey, I'm scared. I see they killed one Navi, and because of this, 80,000 people get destroyed. What's going to happen to me who destroyed 80,000 people or more? That even that type of tshuva is accepted by the Ribono Shel Olam. And this is the Kina that memorializes that incident. The next Kina is Lamed Vav 36. This is also Rav Yehuda Halevi, and this is really one of the most beautiful poems ever written about Eretz Yisrael. This introduces a whole section of the Kinos that are called Sionim, Zionides, poems about the love and yearning for Eretz Yisrael. Again, you need to know a little bit about Rav Yehuda Halevi. He grew up in Spain. He was what you might call upper middle class or even wealthy. Baruch Hashem, he was always a firm person, a learned person, a Talmid Chacham. But he was very much involved in the political, social life of Spain. He was involved in poetry, in literature, in secular pursuits as well. And he had a very, very good and comfortable life in Spain. But he had a tremendous hishtaikikus, a tremendous yearning to come to the land of Israel. Eretz Yisrael at that time was a land that was full of poverty, persecution, wild animals, hostile nations. It did not have the conveniences that we know today. Even traveling to Eretz Yisrael would be very, very dangerous. If you recall the Kuzari, which is the dialogue between the king of the Khazars and the Chaver, the rabbi, and Yehuda Halevi is writing both sides of the story. You may recall that the Melech asks the Chaver, asks the rabbi, I don't understand you Jews. You pray every day, bring us back to Eretz Yisrael, and you have a chance to go, and why don't you go? And the Chaver answers to the king, Your Majesty, this is our shame, and this is our embarrassment, and this is our busha. That we ask Hashem for something, but it is like the twittering of birds. It doesn't mean anything. This is Rav Yehuda Halevi himself talking. And if you know, the end of the Kuzari, the story actually says, the Chaver is going to Eretz Yisrael. And that is what Rav Yehuda Halevi did. That he traveled to Eretz Yisrael, great, great dangers. He had no money. He came there poverty-stricken. And according to legend, it is brought down in some Rishonim, but we don't know if it's an actual historical fact. Outside of the gates of Yerushalayim, an Arab horseman drove by and pierced him, and he died right by the gates of Yerushalayim without ever entering. in this song where he turns to Tzion, Eretz Yisrael, and he says, Sion, why don't you pray for your people, for the Jews to be with you? Pray for those who are imprisoned in the Golus, the Shlom Asirayach. But what is so unique about this song is, unlike the other Kinos, by the way, this was not even written as a Kina. It was put in as a Kina, but it was not written for Tisha B'Av in particular. All the other Kinos ask Hashem for Geula, build the Beis HaMikdash, bring Mashiach. This goes off in a different direction. This says, even if the land is desolate, even if we are poverty-stricken, even if we suffer, I would want my arms and my legs and my feet to be scratched, walking on the stones of the Nevi'im, walking in the place of Kedusha, breathing the air that even Moshe Rabbeinu was not Zeicha. This is a whole new perspective. He sees the bracha of Eretz Yisrael and the connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, not only in terms of all the good things that are going to happen, but as difficult as the reality is. He says, I prefer the poverty and suffering of coming to the land of Hashem over all of the riches and the comfort and the decadence that I can have in the lands that are far from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that is the uniqueness of this song, which basically says, it's especially, I guess, for us who are zocheh to be in Eretz Yisrael, there's a certain nechama, even in the Churban itself, that we are zocheh to be in this land. We take it for granted sometimes. But what a great, great gift, even b'churbanan, even b'golos, even in persecution. And the truth is we have it a lot physically better than Rabbi Yehuda Halevi had it. To be makir, the great gift that Hashem gave us. And then be Messiah for the ultimate Geula as well. Yeah, the next one is 41, Mem Aleph. And this is a Kina that is written by Rav Meir of Rottenburg, Rav Meir Rottenburg, one of the greatest Gedolei HaRishonim. He was the Rebbe of the Rosh. And this describes the burning of 24 wagon loads of manuscripts of Gemara in Paris in the year 1242. And one has to remember, this is before printing. The 24 wagon loads of Gemaras were virtually all of the Sfarim in the entire country. It was almost impossible to learn any Torah Shebaal Peh, because of this. And this occurred on the Friday, the Erev Shabbos of Parshas Chukas, in the year 1242. And because there was an Echalaim, that there was a remez, that the Gezerah was for that day, not the calendar date, but Erev Shabbos Chukas, Zeis Chukas HaTorah. This is the Gezerah against the Torah that HaKadosh Baruch Hu promulgated. It is recorded in the Shibalei Leket, some other Rishonim, that this is a Tainus Tzadikim, that there are Tzadikim that fast every year to this day on Erev Shabbos, Parshas Chukas, to commemorate this tremendous destruction. And remember, Rottenberg talks about the idea that the Torah is destroyed. How can Am Yisrael possibly survive? It is recorded in the Chidah and some other sources that this tremendous Chorban of the Torah was connected to another burning that happened a few years earlier, in which the Rambam's works were burnt by the Catholic Church because of some complaints that Jews made. There were Jews, some of them Talmidei Chachamim, who felt that the Rambam's works should not be studied, especially the Moreh Nevuchim, because this was integrating Aristotelian philosophy with Torah. And as a result, the Catholic Church, now no Jews burnt the Rambam's Sfarim, that's a common misconception, but the church that looks for any excuse said, oh, the Jews don't like the Rambam's works, we'll burn it. And there was a Sreifa several years earlier of the Rambam's works. And the Gedolim said later that because of the bizayon in Klal Yisrael not showing kavod for the Rambam, we merited losing all of the 24 wagon loads of Torah. It's brought down that Rabbeinu Yaina who had been involved in the anti-Rambam campaign, dedicated his life to tshuva because of this. He felt he needed to do tshuva. He wrote the Sharei Tshuva, and he wanted to go to Eretz Yisrael, to Tveria, to ask mechila at the Rambam's kever, but he died before he reached Eretz Yisrael. So in this way, Rav Meir Rottenberg talks about the burning of the Torah, but he includes in it the death of Talmidei Chachamim, etc. And he makes the point that in many, many ways, he uses a very vivid poetic metaphor. Why did Matan Torah is the wedding of Hashem and Am Yisrael? Why did HaKadosh Baruch Hu give the Torah with fire? As if to say HaKadosh Baruch Hu knew ahead of time that this wedding would end in fire, and that is why at the wedding of Matan Torah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu had Eish, because this would end with Eish, and it ends with turning to Hashem's mercy, that we should be Zeicha to keep the Torah in its physical sense and in its spiritual sense. And that way, the Eish of destruction should turn into the Eish of building and warmth and light. One other thing about Rav Meir Rottenberg, it's not Nogea this Kina in particular. Rav Meir Rottenberg, towards the end of his life, was taken hostage and held for ransom, which was a common practice among the medieval rulers. And he paskined, he told his Kehila, they are not to pay any ransom for him based on the principle that when you give in to these demands, it's a Mishnah in Gittin, then the Goyim will keep on taking hostages. And he ordered them not to pay for his ransom. He spent 7 years essentially in prison, although he was allowed to have visitors, and he taught Torah, and he wrote Shuvas. Even after he died, they refused to release the body unless a huge amount of money was paid. Eventually, several years after his death, someone did pay the ransom and was zocheh to be buried next to the Maharam Rottenberg. Let me point out that the Maharam Rottenberg's own Talmud, the Rush, disagreed with his Rebbe's Shita, and he said, a Gadol Hador, you pay whatever ransom you can, but nevertheless, this was the Maharam's psak, and as long as he was alive, that was the psak that was followed. Shalis Rufa Ba'esh. Okay, we're going to do the next to the last Kina. This is Memhei. This is the only Kina that we recite standing up. This is an anonymous Kina. It's an extraordinarily moving and powerful. It begins with the words, Eli Tzion V'Yara. Eli is not Shem Hashem, you don't pronounce it Keli, but Eli means to lament. We should mourn for Tzion and the cities, and it uses two mishalim, like a woman giving birth, a woman in the pains of labor that is suffering, and like a young bride that is widowed by her husband. The concept of getting up and saying a Kina is very, very significant, because although this is a day of mourning, a day of grieving, a day in which we feel that our world, or we should feel, halvai that we would feel, our world is destroyed, it is ultimately the Ratzon Hashem that we have to go on. We have to live a normal life. We have to do mitzvahs. We have to steig. We can't be miyayish. We can't just give up and say that there's no point in going on. So standing up is this idea of returning to normalcy, just like after Shiva. A person is supposed to walk around the block. You return to ordinary life. But when you return to ordinary life, you don't forget about the Beis HaMikdash. You take the Beis HaMikdash with you. You have a Kina that you take with you as you enter ordinary life. That even when it's not Tisha B'Av, we think about the Beis HaMikdash, we think about the Geula. We try to be mispalel to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that we should be Zeicha to the Geula. We try to live a life in which we and Klal Yisrael become worthy of the Geula. So this is the first step towards normalization. We go back into the world, and after Chatzos we sit down in our regular seats and the like, but we take the Chorban with us wherever we go. Now the two Mishalim are very, very important, because let's look at the two Mishalim. The mashal of the widow who loses her husband, that is a permanent loss. Nebuch, a person loses someone, until Techiyas HaMesim at least, they're never going to get him back again. But the woman who's suffering labor, that's a very different type of thing. There is pain, there is struggle, there is suffering. But in the normal course of events, from that pain, from that struggle, from that suffering, will come blessing and new life. In a way, what the Python is trying to do is the Python is trying to juxtapose perception to reality. Our perception is that the Chorban is like a widow that lost her husband, and then that's what Yirmiyahu says. Haisa ki almana. The Jewish people are like a widow. That would suggest permanence. But in reality, the reality is this is not the bereavement of a widow, but this is the pain of a woman in childbirth. That out of this pain, out of this suffering, will come a tremendous geula. May we be zeicha to that geula b'mheira v'yameinu. Now we'll stand up. Eli tziyayin v'yareha kama isha v'tzireha v'chepsuha chadorasa v'yoreha. The next one is a very short one. This is the only one that we say both at night and in the morning. And this is from Rav Shlomo Ibn Gabaral. The acrostic spells out Shlomo. He is the author of Adon Olam, among other things. And this is a very strange dialogue between the tribe of the 10 tribes and the 2 tribes. And that is, the 10 tribes were exiled over 100 years before the Churban, and they are arguing who has it worse. The 10 tribes say we are worse off because we didn't come back and we were exiled years earlier. And the second group says we are worse because we were destroyed twice and you were only destroyed once. And the ultimate message is that it makes no sense to compare who suffers worse. The message ultimately is there has to be unity and achdus among Klal Yisrael. And the Python ends with the idea that Hashem, who has rachamim on his people, will have rachamim both for the 10 tribes and the 2 tribes. And there will be a time in which all 12 Shvatim are going to be reunited in Eretz Yisrael with the Binyan Beis HaMikdash. Shomron kol titin mitzvani avonai l'eretz acheres yitzuni banai v'liva t'zakos rabonai v'tzay meshin elani adonai chadei shameinu kimei kadmeinai kinomecha b'nei Yerushalayim adonai ashrei v'secha.